All right, this mic is working. It's on now. It's working now. All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My apologies. We had a little technical difficulty, and we had a special meeting of GAO in this chamber, and it just ended, and now we are going to begin the regularly scheduled meeting for the Land Use and Transportation Committee. I'm Supervisor Malia Cohen, chairwoman of this committee, and to my left is Supervisor Aaron Peskin. Our clerk is the ever so lovely and talented Elisa Somera, and want to give a shout out to our friends at SFGov TV, Leo D'Assis and Jesse Smith. Thank you for helping us with this broadcast. Madam Clerk, do we have any announcements today?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Please make sure to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of the file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today will appear on the November 29th Board of Supervisors agenda unless otherwise stated.
All right, thank you very much. Supervisor Weiner has requested to be excused from today's meeting. May I have a motion to...
So moved.
Thank you very much. And without objection, that motion passes unanimously. All right. Madam Clerk, could you call item 1, please?
Item number 1 is a resolution approving the street name of Martin Avenue for an unnamed street bounded by Brewster Street and Mullen Avenue.
All right, thank you. So I believe we have staff from DPW here today to make a brief presentation on this item. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Javier Rivera from Department of Public Works. As mentioned, this resolution is to name an unnamed street in honor of Mr. Martin Ron, who is a professional or was a professional land surveyor, well known in the land surveying community and construction community. He established his business in 1968 and was dedicated to achieving expertise in the intricate procedures of land surveying in San Francisco. Since then, Mr. Ron's company has been involved with nearly every major project in the city to this date, and it's now being run by second and third generation licensed land surveyors at the helm. So this was a project that was in the Bernal Heights area, part of the Brewster Street Extension Project, which has been going on for a few years now. And we're nearing completion with naming and dedication. That's pretty much it. If you have any questions concerning the project or the street naming, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you very much. Supervisor Peskin has a question.
I have no questions, but I cannot tell you the number of maps that I've seen with Mr. Ron's name on it, and I know a little bit about his family's history. I believe the family are survivors of the Holocaust, and I'm delighted to name a unnamed street after him. Of course, renaming named streets is always extremely controversial, but when you find unnamed streets, usually works out okay.
A lot easier. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm in agreement. I think this is an excellent idea. Very, very thoughtful. I'm glad we're doing this. We're going to take public comment.
Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I would like to invite you to come up for public comment on item number 1. Just as a reminder, you'll have 2 minutes. 2 minutes to speak. You'll hear a soft chime indicating that you have 30 seconds remaining on your 2-minute allotment. Please come on up to the podium if you'd like to speak on this item.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. My name is Mary Nenig. I am a resident of Bernal Heights, and I have lived there since 1994. Most people think the neighborhood they live in is a special place, and we are no different in Bernal Heights. We really feel like we have a special niche there that we love and take care of. The proposal to change the name, it wasn't easy to find this. It was posted on 2 lampposts on Brewster Street, but you would have to be walking along there and look at the post and find out that this was going to happen. Someone brought it to my attention, and I sent out information to approximately 15 or 20 neighbors in the approximate area of the area in question. And I have received approximately 8 to 10 responses. The most significant response is that the neighbors wish no change. You know, after you live there a little while, you know that that's Brewster Street, and there is a sign at the beginning of the street that says Brewster. There have been a few other names that have been suggested, which if we want, I can divulge them to you. But I have to say that having lived there, every UPS driver, every FedEx driver, every person who delivers pizza in the city or to Bernal Heights, and every cab knows how to get to our home. And interestingly enough, I happen to live on this area called Brewster Street, but my address is 55 Rutledge. So it's a quaint little tale, and we are all very used to Brewster Street, and we feel that by introducing another name into this small area would be disruptive and further confusing. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer.
No questions? Thank you. Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak on this item? Please come up.
Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Perry Nennig. I live at 55 Rutledge. And the woman who just spoke, that's my wife anyway, our house faces on this so-called unnamed street. But it has always been known as Brewster Street, so it really isn't unnamed in our neighborhood. And I just want to emphasize that various merchants trying to find our house, they find it very difficult, and for you to change it to another name like this would make that process even more difficult. So I would kindly request that the situation on that section of street remain unchanged. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public that'd like to speak? Okay, public comment is closed at this time. Quick question for the DPW representative. How will life change for the people that live on Brewster Street?
Theoretically, the area that is being renamed, or I should say being named, not renamed, there's nobody living there. It's actually going over DPW property at the moment, so addresses will not change.
There's no economic impact
There's
on
no
the individual
economic impact.
households?
No, none for the local households. There are signs in the area that can be confusing, but other than that, there's no direct change to people living in the neighborhood.
Okay.
Madam Chair, if I may respectfully make a suggestion. Normally, when we rename a street, the policy is that for a period, I believe, of 5 years, the two names are on the street. Granted, this is an unnamed public right-of-way, but perhaps in deference to the individuals that have testified today, we could have the sign read Martin M. Ron Street, parens, Brewster, for a period of time. I'm not going to put it in the resolution unless the chairwoman wishes to do so, but as a friendly suggestion, that might help the transition here.
We could certainly do that, make it part of the sign as a stamp. We follow everything else the same procedure, so I don't see how this would be an issue.
All right. That sounds good. Supervisor Peskin, I'm happy to entertain it as if you want to put it as a motion to change the language. The other thing is I just understand that no one lives there, right? You said it's a public right-of-way.
Correct. It's a public right-of-way. It's a road that was built by DPW.
Right.
And it sort of bends off of Brewster Street proper.
Okay. And is this land, where the street that you guys built, is there land that's developable around it? Will there be people, residential living in some point in the future?
Most likely not. It would, just because the lots are substandard now for planning. Most likely, it'd probably remain as open space in that area.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Did you want to make a motion, Supervisor? If not, we can just accept it and...
I could. Why don't we hear, if you're willing to reopen public comment, Madam Chair, maybe we can ask the nearby neighbors on Rutledge whether or not
Sure.
that would be an acceptable compromise for them.
All right, so I'm going to reopen up public comment at this time. This is still a reminder, you'll have 2 minutes to speak. Thank you. Ma'am, did you want to come up and share your thoughts on this compromise?
Thank you for reopening comment. I do want to say that there is a stretch of undeveloped land in this area, and oftentimes cars from out of the neighborhood park along there. They throw beer cans, condoms, debris in this undeveloped land. Recently, the neighbors in the area, and after many calls to the city to please come and clean it up, they have never done so. I shouldn't say never. They came one time and they actually just butchered the area, cutting down trees recklessly. It was just terrible. So recently, we have had 2 days where the neighbors have gotten out there. They have cleaned the streets, they have pruned the foliage, swept, washed the streets, and they really take pride in this area. It's interesting to have a compromise, but I don't know how naming a street, Martin, Ron, in all respect to him, and Brewster, will make this any less confusing.
All right, thank you. Thank you. All right, public comment is closed at this time. Thank you. All right, let's just deal with the legislation that we have in front of us.
I have no amendment and would suggest that we send this item to the full board with recommendation as it is.
Great. Without objection, passes. Thank you. All right, Madam Clerk, could you call item 2, please?
Item number 2 is an ordinance amending the administrative code to prohibit the city from entering into or extending leases for the extraction of fossil fuel from city-owned land and requiring inspections and evaluations for such land.
All right, Supervisor Avalos is the sponsor for this particular item, and he's not able to join us today, but we have his aide, Jeremy Pollack, who will be speaking on the item. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chair Cohen, Supervisor Peskin, Jeremy Pollack, Legislative Aide to Supervisor Avalos. This ordinance was in front of you at the full Board of Supervisors last week, and it had a full hearing at the Budget and Finance Committee. At the last moment, the Planning Department realized that it inadvertently did not include the required CEQA finding, and so the amendment before you simply adds a finding that this amendment is categorically exempt from CEQA and makes a reference to planning's findings on that. And so we would ask that you simply forward this to the full board again as a committee report after public comment. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. All right.
Madam Chair, I do have a couple of questions for
Sure.
the Department of Real Estate because I see them sitting there. And insofar, and I acknowledge I am a co-sponsor of this measure, but I actually had 3 questions for the Department of Real Estate. One is, do you have any sense of what the sale price, assuming the sale of the 800-acre property subject to the deed restriction would be?
Currently, I don't have that information, but I'll be happy to give it to you.
And the second question is, I assume that pursuant to Chapter 23 of the Administrative Code, the sale and the form of deed would have to come back to this body if it were sold.
Correct. I believe Director Updike mentioned that at the committee at Budget and Finance. Any transaction of that sort would come back to the full board.
And then the third question is, how did you come up with the $1,000 per acre for the solar energy revenue estimate?
I defer to the PUC on that matter.
Oh, is PUC here?
I don't.
Hi, Supervisors. John Scarpullo with the PUC. We can come back and explain how we have that dollar amount.
If you can be ready to do that tomorrow when we consider the item at the full board, I'd be curious to see what solar comps you have out of Kern County that would substantiate that.
We will get that for you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and take public comment. If there's any member of the public that'd like to join us in this conversation, item 2 is up for public comment. Seeing none, public comment is closed at this time. Thank you. All right. Colleagues, or Supervisor Peskin, is there a motion for this item?
I would move that we send this item back to the full board with recommendation again.
As a committee
As a committee report.
As a committee report.
Excellent. Thank you. Without objection, it passes. All right, Madam Clerk, item 3, please.
Item number 3 is an ordinance amending the planning code to change the requirement from 5 to 2 years that student housing be owned or leased by an educational institution to be exempt from the inclusionary housing program and making appropriate findings.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have Mr. Andres Powers from Supervisor Weiner's office, as well as Aaron Starr from Planning. Both of them will be presenting today.
Good afternoon, President Cohen and Supervisor Peskin. Andres Power here for Scott Weiner. San Francisco is short a staggering number of approximately 40,000 student beds. This is just really truly remarkable. These 40,000 students compete with everyone else who's looking for housing, which makes housing more expensive for everyone. A few years ago, Supervisor Weiner authored legislation to incentivize the development of new student housing while making it abundantly clear that it was illegal to convert existing general population housing to student housing in San Francisco. Student housing, as it is today, is generally exempt from inclusionary requirements so long as that housing remains as student housing. And existing law requires that if at any point housing entitled as student housing later decides to convert to general population housing, that at that point the project is required to meet all of its inclusionary requirements plus interest. Today's ordinance in no way alters this requirement. Student housing can be provided in 2 ways. The educational institution itself can build the housing for its own students, or one or more educational institutions can band together and master lease a building that is built by a third party. So in the latter circumstance, the current law requires that the master lease be for a minimum of 5 years. And as the Planning Commission report points out, which is in your packet, those 5 years are said to be a significant barrier for educational institutions for a variety of reasons. And in fact, there was a hearing earlier this year at the land use, at this committee, on this matter, and the educational institutions brought this up as being one of the primary obstacles to entering into housing for their students. So again, this legislation today amends the master lease requirement from being 5 years to 2 years. And again, as is today, at any point, whether it's at 5 years, at 2 years, at 10 years, at 20 years, if the housing reverts to being general population housing, they're required to meet all of their inclusionary housing requirements. And again, that does.
Mr. Powers, can you repeat the last part? So because when I read this over the weekend, I was like, wait a minute, 5 years to 2 years. So you're saying if at the end of the 2-year master lease, they don't have another 2-year or 5-year master lease, then other provisions kick in that require them to do inclusionary housing, or how does that work?
Yeah, so whatever the inclusionary housing requirements were in place at the time that the project was originally entitled, they would be so essentially, basically, they'd have to fee out of that using those requirements. So they could not convert to general population housing without feeing out plus paying interest over that deferred period.
And how does the planning department? I know you used to work there, but how does the planning department enforce that?
So it's a relationship between Mo, HCD, and the planning department. The original ordinance requires these projects to report annually to Mo in terms of who the tenants are and who is living in these buildings. And any violation is, and that's done under penalty of perjury, just like pretty much everything else we do in the city. And it's up to the planning department as the entity that their commission entitled the original project to deal with any enforcement issues should they arise.
But at the end of the 2 years, they either have to do another master lease in that location or another location, or fee out with interest.
Well, we're talking about a specific building, so it's that location. And so at 2 years, should they choose to revert back to general population housing, and perhaps I'll let Aaron speak to this more concretely, but they are required to pay the inclusionary requirements and presumably other things as well.
It's just a little counterintuitive to me, because it seems to me like you would want to enter into a longer master lease because it reduces your risk of having to pay the inclusionary fee. I mean,
and I think, and
I'm happy to give them more flexibility, but it seems like 2 years is a really short period of time.
So I think, and there's also a letter from a variety of educational institutions in the packet that describe this.
No, I saw it, and I was impressed by it.
And the concern is I think it's for the smaller institutions in particular that the longer commitment actually ends up being a risk for them as well. And so having a shorter duration is it's better for them. Of course, they'll always have the option to renew, and generally speaking, I think the intent would be that they would.
That makes sense to me. Was there any consideration by Supervisor Wiener's office to have a size threshold differentiation?
No. I mean, going back to when we originally authored the legislation, we just made up, to be totally honest with you, made up the 5 years as something that seemed reasonable. It wasn't based necessarily on any feedback that we had received at that point. We've been told that 5 years is too much for these institutions. And again, I think the point to call out, though, Supervisor Peskin, to your point, this master lease provision generally is used by the smaller institutions. The larger institutions are presumably are building their own housing.
Yeah, it seems like there's a sea difference between UC Hastings, albeit they're not actually subject to local law,
UCSF,
and the San Francisco Art Institute on Chestnut Street that has a very small student population.
Right. So to your question, no, that we did not think about a variation, but if you have any thoughts on that, I'd be happy to think about it.
I'm inclined to support our likely outgoing supervisor in his final pieces of legislation.
Appreciate that, Supervisor. And Aaron, I'll hand it over to Aaron Starr from the Planning Department for a very quick few words.
Thank you. Mr. Starr.
Thank you, Supervisors and Andres. The Planning Commission considered this item on September 8th of this year and unanimously voted to recommend approval. In making their decision, the Commission found that there is a shortage of nearly 40,000 beds for student housing in the city, and this shortfall contributes to the overall housing crisis as students are forced to look for housing in a very limited and expensive housing stock. That the proposed ordinance does not change the current law, which prohibits conversion of existing housing stock to student housing, and that the ordinance leaves in place the requirement that student housing projects fulfill their inclusionary housing requirements should the housing ever be converted back to market rate housing. That concludes my comments. Andres went over the ordinance, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Supervisor Peskin, do you have any questions for Mr. Starr?
Not that I haven't asked.
All right, fantastic. Thank you for your presentation, gentlemen. We're going to go ahead and go into public comment at this time. Please, public comment is open. Mr. Colin, it's good to see you.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. And the HAC is proud to have helped write and pass the two pieces of legislation that brought student housing, first with Supervisor Dufty in 2010, second with Supervisor Wiener. When the second one passed, there was a lot of news about it, and I was getting a call a week from national student housing developers saying, great, we're coming to San Francisco. We want to build student housing. And pretty much nothing happened. And what became clear is that the schools are really pretty risk averse, and the small schools had to carry the master leases on their balance sheet. And being precariously financed and risk averse, they didn't want to do that. And they felt that 5 years was too much, as Mr. Powers suggested, and that 2 years would be something that might entice more of them into master leasing student housing, something that we strongly support and want to see take off and accelerate a lot more. So this actually came at the request. We've heard from some of the small schools. Well, would this work? Yes, we think so. I think it deserves to be tried, and put it in, see if 2-year will get more of it going, and I think it deserves your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak on this item? All right, seeing none, public comment is closed. Thank you. Is there a motion for this item?
I'd move this item to the full board with recommendation.
All right, without objection, motion passes. Thank you. Madam Clerk, could you call item 4, please?
Item number 4 is an ordinance amending the planning code and zoning map to create the Mission and 9th Street Special Use District, changing the height limits and making appropriate findings.
All right. I've got in my notes that we've got Ms. Tina Chang from the Planning Department to present this item. If she's not here, it's okay, because what we're going to do is I'm going to take public comment, but this item's going to need to be continued. Okay, perfect. All right, so let's go ahead and go into public comment. If there's anyone here that'd like to speak on item 4, please come up. Seeing none, public comment is closed. So, Supervisor Peskin, it's my understanding that this committee can't act on this item until we hear the corresponding general plan amendment. So, therefore, I'm going to ask for a motion to continue this item for our November 28th meeting.
I'm sorry, which date?
I'd like to make a motion. I'd love for you to make a motion to have this item continue to our November 28th meeting.
So moved.
Excellent. Thank you. Without objection. All right. Item 5, please.
Item number 5 is an ordinance amending the health code to revise the definitions of development projects and large and small residential projects that are subject to the alternate water source system requirements, providing authorization for their review and approval, and making appropriate findings.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. So we have, again, Andres Power from Supervisor Wiener's office here to present on this item.
Good afternoon again, President Cohen, Supervisor Peskin. Today's ordinance before you is a cleanup amendment to our original ordinance that Supervisor Wiener authored back in 2005. That ordinance requires that new buildings greater than 250,000 square feet also include facilities for water recycling. In this era of unbridled climate change and what will likely to be continued and systemic drought here in California, we need to be smarter about how we use water and not treat it as the precious resource that it really is. Today's ordinance clarifies that that projects with developments that have multiple buildings, that those multiple buildings count towards the 250,000 square foot threshold. This was the original intent of our ordinance back when we authored it in 2005, but there's been a little bit of disagreement in that language, and so today we are here to clarify that. Basically, that is it, and we're happy to have your support. The PUC is here if you would like a quick primer in water recycling, but that is at your choice. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to go ahead and go into public comment. Is there any public comment on item 5? Mr. Colon, welcome back.
Thank you, Supervisors. Tim Colon on behalf of the Housing Action Coalition, and we stand in strong support of where this legislation is going. About a half dozen of our members are going to be working on projects that are going to hopefully deliver recycled water. It's inescapable with how we come to terms with climate change and the possibility of systemic drought and completely new, different future that we start to move in this direction that's going to give us the tools we need to stop flushing our toilets and watering our medians with hetchy water. So that said, we're working on a few last details. We think that we're very close. There are things that have to do with implementation. We've had conversations with the supervisor's office. Think this is eminently sensible legislation and should move forward, and we're looking forward to just getting the last couple of tweaks on implementation forward. So it has our support.
Thank you. That's good to know. Are there any other members of the public that'd like to speak on item 5? All right. Seeing none, public comment for item 5 is closed. Thank you. Supervisor Peskin, how about we get a motion on this item?
I'd move this item to the full board with recommendation.
All right. Without objection, that motion passes. Thank you. Tim. Madam Clerk, are there any other items before us today?
No, that concludes our business for today.
All right. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.